In this week's episode of The Situation Room, we're going to do something a little bit different. Every week, we bring you a selection of relevant news items covering conflicts around the globe with the critical context and nuance required to make this strange and complicated world make a bit more sense. This time, however, we're going to take a step back and attempt a far broader challenge to examine where each of today's major and minor conflicts stands at the time of writing, and forecast what experts around the world expect for those conflicts in the months to come. It's a new format for us, something we may do just once, or if you, our viewing audience, enjoys it, then we'll probably do it again. So, at the end of this episode, let us know what you think in the comments, and consider sharing this piece with anybody looking to understand the world's wars and crisis zones better, because why not? So let's dive in. The big three. To begin today's special episode, we're going to take a deep dive into each of the conflicts that we'll refer to as the Big Three. Major wars where the intersection of global public interest and mass human suffering mark them as conflicts that will define this period in history. Those Big Three are the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israel-Hamas war and its associated conflicts, and bringing perhaps less public interest, but with the highest potential for human suffering of all, the Sudanese civil war. Now, we'll begin with the war in Ukraine, where after 2.5 years of brutal fighting, neither Russia nor Ukraine appears close to claiming total victory. Geographically, the fighting is still mostly constrained to Ukraine's eastern regions, although raids, limited assaults, and most of all, aerial long-range weapons have broadened the scope of the engagement somewhat. Yet at this stage of the war, uncertainty prevails in every part of the theatre. The worst of the fighting is taking place in Ukraine's Donbass region, the Eastern Front, where the fighting momentum appears clearly to be on Russia's side. The Russian gains are neither quick nor decisive, but after more than a year of fighting where battle lines barely shifted at all, Russia has been able to force Ukraine into a series of fallbacks. Their objective is the city of Pokrovsk, a strategically significant location where road and rail access are the key to a broader Russian takeover in the area. Take Pokrovsk, and Russia can choke off supply lines and conduct encirclements, attacking in other directions until Ukraine is forced out of most of the region, or oblast, of Donetsk. At the time of writing, Russia's spear thrust towards Pokrovsk is not yet complete, but Ukraine could probably only hold the city for so long, and Russia is now taking positions for a first stage of encirclements that could make the fall of the city inevitable. Said one Ukrainian officer speaking to the BBC, quoting here, "Look at the Donetsk region, it looks like a squid. To defend all the tentacles, you need a far bigger number of positions. Observation posts. You need to hold back far bigger assault groups because the Russians are trying to attack from all sides." The quote ends. Without relief, Pokrovsk will be a battlefield sooner rather than later, setting up one of two possibilities. Option 1, a repeat of the Battle of Bakhmut, where a similarly important city was turned into a meat grinder where tens of thousands of lives were lost to hold the position. The other option, the fall of Pokrovsk, setting up an autumn of Russian consolidation in Donetsk before settling in for a long, cold winter. Perhaps the one ray of hope on this axis is the possibility of Moscow's forces exhausting their offensive potential in the fight for the city. Russia has expended enormous resources this summer, suffering an average of over 1,100 killed and wounded per day. So many pieces of equipment have been lost that the peak of Russia's material advantage has probably passed. The Kremlin's gamble has been that such eye-watering losses are worth it for the chance to secure the Donbass. Yet these tactics also mean the offensive might culminate short of that goal. The other major battleground right now is Kursk, a region in Russia rather than Ukraine, where Ukrainian soldiers launched a surprise attack and captured over 1,000 square kilometers of territory, including more than 100 settlements. Ukraine was able to blow up bridges and isolate Russian troops in Kursk in hopes of encircling them and threatening to wipe them out, but the broader goal of the attack has not been realized. That goal, per Ukraine's own leaders, was to force Russia to divert some of its troops away from the embattled east and relieve pressure on Ukrainian troops there. But that hasn't happened, and a few days prior to the time of writing, Ukraine's president acknowledged that the first Russian counterattacks into Kursk had begun. As of now, it appears that those counterattacks have taken only a handful of settlements back, and that success rate isn't likely to sustain on its own, considering that spread-out Ukrainian forces there can pull back to more defensible positions. Yet a larger-scale counterattack is still possible, and Ukrainian forces have reported that their attempts at a forward advance aren't coming so easily anymore. Over the next several months, it's possible that Ukraine will hold part of the territory, but taking more without committing more troops is a risky affair, and it's not yet pulled away substantial numbers of fighters from Pokrovsk. Elsewhere in the war, Russia and Ukraine are both broadening their long-range strike capabilities, with Russia receiving ballistic missiles from Iran and Ukraine seemingly soon to be cleared for use of long-range NATO weapons for strikes. For his part, Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed that if Ukraine does receive permission from the West for the unrestricted use of long-range weapons, then Russia will consider itself to be at war with NATO. That threat, however, appears to be taken less and less seriously by Western leaders, in large part because British and French-supplied Storm Shadow missiles have already been used to destroy Russian assets in Crimea without provoking any backlash. As defense analyst Jimmy Rushton wrote on X, quote, "Remember that Anglo-French Storm Shadow cruise missiles demolished the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters in Sevastopol, Crimea, which Russia has claimed to be an intrinsic part of Russia since its illegal annexation in 2014, and Putin did nothing." Meanwhile, Ukraine's Western-supplied military hardware has had mixed results, with the Abrams tank pulled from the battlefield and one F-16 fighter jet having fatally crashed already. But other vehicles and heavy equipment are doing substantially better. And finally, peace talks appear as far off as they've ever been, with occasional suggestions for a peace by Western leaders like German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and US presidential candidate Donald Trump earning a lukewarm reception at best. For the next several months, major breakthroughs appear unlikely in any direction in the Russia-Ukrainian war, just more shifts, adjustments, and postural changes on the battlefield, each one translating to the loss of thousands of human lives. Next up, the Middle East's defining current conflict, which we could describe simply as the Israel-Hamas war, or which we could describe by borrowing from a recent quote by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Quoting him here, "Iran is fighting us," meaning Israel, "on a 7-front war." The basis for Netanyahu's comment comes from a rapid shift in Israel's Middle Eastern military engagements over the last few months, from a focused occupation and assault on the Gaza Strip to root out the Hamas organization, to a multi-dimensional engagement where each of Israel's adversaries maintains loyalty to one common backer: Iran. It's a change that's been increasingly evident since Iran and Israel's direct exchange of long-range strikes back in April, and since Israel's counterinsurgent operations in Gaza have morphed from a process of clearing territory, district by district, into a process of holding control over that territory and pivoting to address Hamas holdouts as they pop up. Hamas, on its own, still has proven capable of causing harm to Israel. In one example, Hamas reportedly had several Israeli hostages killed shortly before they might otherwise have been rescued by Israel Defense Forces. Yet at this stage, Israeli operations in Gaza have been defined far less by strategic or tactical evolutions from either side of the localized conflict than by the nature of Israel's airstrike campaign and its human cost. But Netanyahu's statement about a war on 7 fronts evidences a broader truth: that while Hamas now almost certainly lacks the means to attempt another October 7th-style attack in the near to mid-future, Hamas isn't the only security threat Israel has to worry about in the coming months. The Israel-Hamas war and the carnage in Gaza that the Israeli military has wrought have kicked up a hornet's nest that includes the nation of Iran itself, the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, a network of Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, Palestinian militants in the West Bank, and other non-Hamas threats in Gaza. And increasingly, Israel's military conduct suggests that it intends to broaden the conflict with those other adversaries over the next few months, rather than pursue a strategy that might see tensions drawn down. In one example, former War Cabinet member and prominent Israeli politician Benny Gantz told US and Israeli officials just recently that it's time for Israel to shift its war footing toward Hezbollah in Lebanon to the north. In late August, Israel launched mass preemptive strikes across southern Lebanon to get in front of what it said was an imminent large-scale drone and rocket attack. A week later, Israel began a major series of crackdowns in the West Bank, leaving much of the city of Jenin, a known hub for militant activity, as a smoking husk in the aftermath of deadly firefights. In Syria, after numerous airstrikes from its more militarily powerful southern neighbor, a raid by Israeli commandos destroyed a Hezbollah-aligned missile production facility just weeks ago. And although Iran has vowed a mass retaliation after another suspected Israeli attack killed the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Iran's capital city, that attack has still yet to happen. All this takes place against the backdrop of a continued international push for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, a step long regarded as the last best chance of stopping the violence before the war spreads across the Middle East. But seemingly intractable differences between Israel and Hamas appear, at least for now, as if they won't be bridged anytime soon. International optimism around a potential peace deal, particularly optimism from the US, appears to be fading at the same time as Israel appears to be pushing the limits of its own offensive actions against Hezbollah, West Bank militant groups, Syria, and even Iran itself. The next few months aren't likely to see an end to the Israel-Hamas conflict, but instead a tightrope walk of escalating tensions that may or may not turn into an all-out war between Israel and a much more dangerous collection of adversaries. And then there is the ongoing tragedy in Sudan, where for about a year and a half now, a bitter conflict has split the nation and led to widespread allegations of ethnic cleansing and atrocities on both sides. Since April of last year, Sudan has been torn between the forces of the National Army on one side and a massive paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces on the other. At the time of writing, some 10 million people or more are believed to be displaced. Perhaps 150,000 are dead, and some 25 million Sudanese are at risk of starvation, with some portions of the country having already crossed the threshold right into famine. When it comes to the famine element of the civil war, we'll refer to a recent episode published right here on this channel dedicated to a complete overview of that horrific situation. But what we will emphasize here is that there are millions of people facing acute hunger in a crisis that the world seems to be largely oblivious to. The other factor compounding the situation is that neither the Sudanese army nor the RSF are interested in stepping aside to allow humanitarian aid to flow through. Both sides are using hunger as a weapon of war and continue to battle despite the civilians in their crosshairs. In recent weeks, the United Nations has accused both sides of a range of war crimes and called for large-scale international intervention. But aside from a possible broadening of an existing arms embargo, peacekeeping interventions appear unlikely. It doesn't help that the conflict is being fueled by outside actors. Although Abu Dhabi denies it, a UN expert panel has found that the United Arab Emirates is supporting the RSF with arms and gold, even evacuating some of their wounded fighters to be treated in UAE hospitals. Egypt and Iran, meanwhile, are thought to be backing the Sudanese army, while Russia appears to be both building ties with the military, while simultaneously also using the Wagner Group to supply the RSF. Even Ukraine has dispatched a small number of special forces to the region to help the Sudanese army liquidate Wagner fighters. Insofar as the fighting itself goes, the RSF now holds a majority of Sudan's major population centers in the country's more southerly regions. The capital city of Khartoum and the nearby city of Omdurman are each the site of brutal fighting, although the RSF has the upper hand in Khartoum, while the army has held tenuous control over much of Omdurman. The RSF has run through much of Darfur, and although it's not yet clear because of the sheer difficulty of gaining on-the-ground media access to the area, widespread ethnic violence is suspected there. To give just one horrific example, after the city of El Janina fell to the RSF last year, it's thought that between 10 and 15,000 members of the minority Masalit tribe were slaughtered. Should the besieged town of El Fasher in North Darfur likewise fall, it's thought that a similar massacre could take place. The RSF, after all, grew out of the Arab supremacist Janjaweed militias that conducted the Darfur genocide. As the army loses control of the region, analysts and experts fear they've decided to finish the job. But perhaps the most strategically critical area of the fighting, as it stands today, are the RSF's efforts to extend their reach southward toward the city of Ad Damazin, after having seized the city of Sinjar in July. Ad Damazin is important for a few reasons, partly because it's the place where many thousands of fleeing people have settled down for the short term. It's also not far from Sudan's southern border with South Sudan and Ethiopia, and to take the city would be to functionally encircle the Sudanese military's holdings in the southern regions they still control. But it also cuts off a valuable strategic outlet for the military government, who've largely retreated to Port Sudan, a critical port city on the Red Sea. Although Port Sudan is a thriving population center with a metro area population of 500,000, it's still far from most of the country's population. In the Sudanese northern regions, there are a few strategic targets worth taking outright, instead of just cutting off, while marching down long highways and taking the string of minor cities that lead to Port Sudan should be an achievable task for the RSF, if and only if they can cut off the regime in the south. That's a process that will first see the RSF take the city of Sana'a, where fighting has recently restarted, and then move down toward Ad Damazin, the most likely spot for remaining army forces to hold out if they choose to try and do so. It's this strategic chess match that will likely play out through the next few months against the backdrop of rising starvation and misery across lands controlled by both sides. Unfortunately, international relief seems highly unlikely for Sudan, and until and unless it eventually arrives, the RSF's long, slow march and its willingness to watch Sudan waste away will continue to be the dominant forces in this conflict. Significant conflicts. After the big three, we move to a range of other active conflict zones across the world, some officially recognized as war zones and others perhaps less so. The first among them is Myanmar, where the nation's long-running civil war has settled into a new rhythm over the last several months. We've written at length about the state of Myanmar's civil war on this channel recently, but to summarize, Myanmar's loose coalition of pro-independence and ethnic rebel militias have been able to claim major swaths of territory from the country's ruling regime. That includes nearly every one of Myanmar's towns situated on international borders and large chunks where individual ethnic militias have now begun to set up their own autonomous governments. Meanwhile, millions are internally displaced, while fears of ethnic violence against the country's Rohingya Muslim population have prompted many thousands among their number to flee as well. The coming few months in the conflict are likely to involve some settling down in many areas of the country as the military regime is pushed back to fewer and fewer defensible points. In the countryside, remaining military bases, outposts, and checkpoints are likely to come under continued assault, but fewer and fewer of those relatively easy targets remain at this stage. Instead, it's the regime's more powerful regional command centers, its major cities, and its largest military bases where Myanmar's remaining soldiers are likely to cluster. Myanmar's rebels recently took down a regional command center in the city of Lashio, capturing a regional commander and purportedly arresting 4,000 regime troops in what was a seismic victory for the rebels. After all, that's the first time a regional command post has been captured in some 60 years of continuous asymmetric warfare in the countryside. But as those targets get harder and harder to take, and as the resistance is forced to turn its attention against Myanmar's best defended locations, the conflict will morph from asymmetric insurgency to something more akin to a siege. At this stage, Myanmar's military lacks the ability to strike back against the rebels in the territory that's already fallen to their advance. To do that would spread the regime too thin and force them to rely on troops with exceedingly low morale and apparently limited willingness to fight for their military leaders. But nor can the rebels take the cities or the best defended areas in all-out battle. Instead, the next several months will likely involve Myanmar's rebels trying to infiltrate Myanmar's largest cities and foment a popular uprising there while continuing to place pressure on the junta by constraining access to resources and by launching raids and strikes with consumer drones. There is no guarantee that a collapse behind junta lines would actually happen anytime soon, but at this moment in the conflict, the rebels are pushing up at the outer bounds of what they can accomplish under their current strategy. So, from Myanmar, we turn to the Sahel, the arid region of Africa, where the harsh desert sands of the Sahara give way to the southerly savannas. The nations of the Sahel, from Mali to Chad to Niger to Burkina Faso and more, have long battled against an asymmetric jihadist insurgency out in the Badlands. Yet as several regional nations have suffered military coups and kicked out US and European counterinsurgency support missions, and as the Russian Wagner mercenary organization, rebranded now as Africa Corps, moves in to fill the gap, the region has been no more stable in the last few months than it ever was before. Things are particularly bad in Burkina Faso, where at least 2 million people, or around 10% of the population, are trapped in cities besieged by militants, and as much as 60% of the countryside may be outside government control. But the sad reality is that almost no matter which part of the Sahel you look at, things range from not great to catastrophically awful. In the nation of Mali, multi-dimensional conflict between the national military, a jihadist group known as JNIM, and a patchwork of unaffiliated rebel groups made news in the last couple of months. There, Tuareg rebels, one of the most unaffiliated rebel groups, launched a massive attack on a combined Malian military and Wagner force during a sandstorm, killing dozens of Wagner mercenaries, including many who had fought in Ukraine, Libya, and Syria. Back in Burkina Faso, up to 400 people were shot dead in a village in the northern regions of the country in August after the JNIM jihadist group carried out a major attack. Information on the attack is still scarce and is much needed to soothe the frightened public after a June attack claimed by JNIM left over 100 soldiers dead on an army base. In recent weeks, the attacks have spread to Benin and Togo as Sahel violence begins to spill southward. Unfortunately, the region's capacity for a coordinated response is limited at best, with Wagner suffering military setbacks, the US and France largely pushed out, and each of the region's governments scrambling to figure out a path forward. JNIM and its associated jihadist allies have the initiative in the conflict. They've also got a window of opportunity in front of them over the next few months to carry out further attacks at a moment where the nations of the Sahel have proven themselves thoroughly disorganized and lacking a competent international partner. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a long conflict between the nation's government and a range of adversary militias, most prominently the rebel group M23, seemed for a little while as if it might result in a reprieve. Back in July, M23 and the Congolese government agreed to a ceasefire in hopes that M23's sweeping assault against towns and cities in the eastern regions of the country could be stopped. But since that ceasefire went into effect, the news has not been positive. M23 has continued to capture towns, several of which have capitulated without a fight, and in late August the rebels threatened and possibly even captured the strategically significant town of Kirumba. News on that front has been scarce. M23 has all but isolated the provincial capital in the area where fighting is heaviest, the city of Goma in the province of North Kivu, setting up a dramatic takeover of Goma that's been months in the making. At the time of writing, the Congolese government appears unable to intervene by sending more troops, while accounts from inside Goma tell of a nightmarish and brutal environment in a city under siege. The Congo's civil war is important for a variety of reasons, not least the nation's production of about 70% of the world's critical cobalt supply and an abundance of copper, lithium, gold, and precious gems. But along with the DRC's mineral riches, the last several months have led much of the world to acknowledge a previously overlooked dimension of the war: the increasingly overt involvement of neighboring Rwanda. Led by an autocrat named Paul Kagame, who's long held close ties with the West, Rwanda's role in funneling weapons and resources to M23 has been an uncomfortable reality for a while now. Now, though Rwanda has been increasingly called out for positioning its own troops and weapon systems close to the DRC's border, and although both Rwanda and the DRC have recently engaged in a dialogue brokered by Angola, it's not likely to put a definitive end to the conflict. M23 is too motivated, even beyond Rwanda's support. The DRC's military is too incompetent and too corrupt to stop them, and Rwanda is forgiven for its transgressions far easier than most nations would be in the eyes of its most critical backers. As a result, the next few months see the DRC at a crossroads. On the one hand, there is a path, however narrow, to drawing down the conflict in North Kivu, but on the other, Goma is still under siege. By the year's end, M23 could lay down its arms or gain decisive control over a province of a sovereign nation that's utterly impotent to stop it. Houthis. And across the Red Sea, there are the Houthi rebels of western Yemen, whose missile and drone attacks into the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea have caused a long nightmare for international shipping. Positioned on one of the world's most important maritime trade routes, the Iran-backed Houthi rebel organization has worked hard to show its support for Hamas and Gaza, but while those shows of support sometimes involve attempts to strike Israel directly, they mostly consist of attacks against maritime shipping vessels and the assets of an international military coalition meant to stop them. Over the last few months, the Houthis have sunk or captured multiple massive trade vessels, killed several crew members, and damaged dozens of ships, forcing some companies to redirect their trade vessels and forcing others to accept skyrocketing insurance prices for Red Sea crossings. Nor has the Western coalition had any real success in stopping the Houthis. Although the US-led effort has launched numerous strikes against Houthi territory and interdicted weapons shipments traveling from Iran, it's also suffered the loss of several US-made Reaper drones and proven unable to consistently intercept incoming missiles and drones before they strike their targets. The Houthis have gotten considerably more accurate with their strikes, and they've even adopted the use of dangerous sea drones capable of hitting ships at their waterline and ripping devastating holes in their hull. Over the past several weeks, the Houthis have also watched a disabled oil tanker called the Suyunian as it floats at anchor and burns in the Red Sea, capable of spilling 1 million barrels of oil in what would be one of the most devastating single-ship oil spills in history. At the time of writing, operations to salvage that ship are now underway, although their outcome is unknown. As the Houthis' anti-trade campaign has continued, the UN has issued stark warnings over the potential for Yemen's crisis to worsen, potentially including a return to full-scale war between the Houthis and Yemen's internationally recognized government in the east. As of now, in the autumn of 2024, the Houthis appear able to operate with impunity in their own territory, weathering coalition airstrikes without being deterred from launching further attacks. They've got a strategy that appears to be working for them, with reasons to disengage from their current course. If ongoing Western operations are to achieve any meaningful success in reining them in, those operations will likely need to change substantially from the way they've been carried out thus far. And if Israel finds itself in a full-scale conflict with Hezbollah or even Iran, then the Houthis may yet choose to step up their attacks, while probably soliciting even greater support from Iran as part of a unified war effort. Elsewhere in the Middle East, fears that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, is undergoing a revival have increasingly been realized. In the first half of 2024, ISIS launched more attacks than it did in the entirety of 2023 in an asymmetric barrage that's seen it target civilians, government soldiers and officials, and all range of other targets across both Iraq and Syria. In Syria, the group has launched dozens of ambushes against soldiers of the Assad regime, as well as the forces of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast. The group has run a long campaign of attacks and thefts against oil trucks out in the desert and has set up extortion rackets in many communities while launching random raids on others. In Iraq, the group has taken a similar approach, and although a recent US-led counterinsurgent raid has garnered global headlines for killing 4 top ISIS leaders in Iraq's Anbar province, that raid has still only attacked symptoms of the broader ISIS problem, not its source. At present, ISIS is estimated to have numbers only representing a shadow of its former caliphate. But that's not the point. Having learned the lessons of its operations in the mid-2010s, the group's remaining fighters are leaning fully into asymmetric warfare in areas where they can thrive due to a light presence from the region's governments and autonomous regional armies. They're gaining in resources, they're gaining in numbers, and that's just half the story. All across Syria and Iraq, many thousands of ISIS fighters are in detention, many of whom are being regularly released by the Kurdish-led SDF, and others of whom are likely to enjoy a similar fate as their brothers in arms who've been sprung from prisons en masse recently. Meanwhile, camps for the families of ISIS fighters are increasingly recognized as a breeding ground for future jihadis, raised in places where ISIS brides conduct religious education and morality policing. At the time of writing, ISIS appears to be growing dramatically in Iraq and Syria, and with the United States looking to depart from the area soon, there are fewer and fewer checks left to oppose them. The next few months will likely involve more of the same, and perhaps a worsening of the situation as a whole. Finally, we turn to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, where a long-awaited police intervention led by the African nation of Kenya is failing, at least so far, to produce meaningful results. The intervention was meant to curtail what has become one of the most terrifying organized crime takeovers in recent history, as Haiti's powerful gangs banded together and took over large parts of the capital city of Port-au-Prince. After months of legal wrangling, Kenyan-led forces began to arrive in Haiti at the end of June amidst threats of a war in the streets. Yet despite early successes in which police forces regained control of Port-au-Prince's airport and its fuel terminal, it only took about a month for international aid organizations and security groups to begin preaching the need for greater urgency. Many areas of Port-au-Prince remain under the unchallenged control of the gangs, where criminal leaders continue to govern as they see fit, enlist child foot soldiers, and commit well-documented atrocities against local communities. To fully explain the scale of the violence in Haiti would require hours of footage and leave everyone watching this with lifelong PTSD. Suffice to say, things are bad in a way that seems closer to a post-apocalyptic movie than real life. From January to May alone, some 3,000 people were murdered, an astonishing number in a country of just 11.5 million. Sexual violence is reported to be widespread, while random acts of extreme violence, including the burning of entire communities and the massacre of pedestrians by snipers, has become a near daily occurrence. In a recent indicator of just where the situation is at, Haiti's state of emergency didn't end when it was updated in early September of this year. It was expanded to cover the entire nation as Haiti's gangs worked to expand their influence beyond Port-au-Prince and move to other parts of the country. At the time that the state of emergency was expanded, 1 million people in Port-au-Prince were without power after a power plant was vandalized, adding to a situation where 500,000 people are currently displaced and where 5 million face severe hunger. With several thousand inmates recently escaped from prison in multiple prison breaks, the gangs appear to be growing stronger and seem to be moving not because the pressure from the international intervention is so great, but simply because they can. A contingent of 2,500 extra police have yet to arrive, and recent developments have cast doubt on if they ever will. The African nation of Benin had previously committed to supply 1,500 officers, but the Miami Herald reports that their deployment is now on hold. While the current police force's mission expires at the start of October, there are worries that this Haiti intervention might go the same way as several Haiti interventions past, all ending in failure. After that happens, a resurgence of the gangs in Port-au-Prince is a distinct possibility, and as bad as the situation was before Kenyan police arrived, things will likely get worse as the gangs' confidence will only rise with their departure. Charged flashpoints. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Okay, moving on from active conflict zones, we've also got to discuss a handful of other flashpoints where war isn't ongoing, but where geopolitical tensions suggest that things are as likely to get worse as they are to get better. First on that list are the nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan, where although talks for a lasting peace deal are still underway, they've run into a long sequence of stumbling blocks. After Azerbaijan's takeover of the formerly Armenian separatist region of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan and Armenia have hopes of formalizing the end to their decades-long conflict, with Armenia looking to pivot toward the west and Azerbaijan looking to grow closer to Russia and China. However, domestic discontent in Armenia has proven to be an obstacle for the country's prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan, fearing a return to the widespread protests that broke out when Armenia first revealed that it would work with Azerbaijan to establish a peace. An upcoming round of parliamentary elections adds to the stress, giving concerns that Armenians could elect a coalition that's less interested in peaceful reconciliation with a longtime enemy. Meanwhile, the role of Iran in and around the region is a continued sticking point in negotiations, as are attempts by Azerbaijan to establish a land corridor, granting it access to an exclave territory called Nakhchivan. Azerbaijan also claims that Armenia's constitution enshrines an Armenian territorial claim to Azerbaijan. At present, both sides do appear more inclined to continue with the peace process than back away from it, but where Armenia and Azerbaijan are concerned, initiatives like this aren't done till they're done, and sometimes not even after that. Then there's China and the Philippines, where over the course of a many months-long maritime shoving match, the two East Asian nations have fought back and forth over areas of the South China Sea that both lay claim to. Although their confrontations are not typically lethal, they're a show of brinksmanship by a nation in China trying to expand its sphere of influence against the wishes of a less-equipped neighbor supported by the United States. To lay its claim, China has charged and collided with Philippine naval vessels and Coast Guard vessels with its own, doused Philippine sailors with water cannons, shot at them with lasers and powerful sirens, and menaced them with ships that may belong to the Chinese Coast Guard but would outclass many modern naval warships in a head-to-head confrontation. Over the last several months, the epicenter of the two nations' dispute has been the Sabine Shoal, resource-rich island atoll where a smaller Philippine Coast Guard ship weathered charges and a collision by a larger Chinese vessel. While China has long harassed more isolated Philippine detachments at the Second Thomas Shoal, the Sabine Shoal is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, a fact that has not stopped China from dredging coral in attempts to build out the island. These so-called grey zone engagements don't constitute acts of war, but they represent clear attempts by China to throw its weight around, and it appears to be working. At the time of writing, the Philippines ship has been forced to return to port for structural repairs and to get the crew adequate food after their resupply was repeatedly blocked. It's a seemingly small victory for China, but one that is sure to embolden the larger nation in the months to come and place pressure on the beleaguered Philippine Marines at the Second Thomas Shoal, who've got to know that they're next on China's chopping block. Then we turn to Bangladesh in the aftermath of the recent overthrow of longtime dictator Sheikh Hasina. After a successful youth-led revolution, Bangladesh is now under the leadership of Nobel laureate and longtime Hasina critic Muhammad Yunus. But his leadership, although certainly more popular than Hasina, isn't received well everywhere. Bangladesh's most important and most powerful next-door neighbor, India, was a longtime ally of Hasina and now hosts her in exile. The combination of her continued stay there and India's disapproval of what it refers to as megaphone diplomacy by Yunus, trying to raise important but fraught issues by pressuring through the media, have led to a sudden fraying of relations between the countries. Yunus and the new Bangladeshi government hope to see Hasina eventually returned to stand trial for the killings of those who died during the recent revolution. Meanwhile, Bangladesh's public remains only cautiously optimistic about its new set of leaders, especially while action against those who helped prop Hasina up still is in the works behind the scenes. While Bangladesh is far better off now than it was about 2 months ago, it's still in the critical early stages of reconstruction, where popular discontent, political loyalism to Hasina, or potentially even unilateral action by the military still pose threats. Bangladesh is getting better, but it's not out of the woods. Venezuela. And if Bangladesh isn't out of the woods, then Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro never left them. Venezuela has been going through a difficult time for quite a while, but its problems intensified quickly after a contentious election ended with a new term for dictator Nicolas Maduro, despite widespread recognition, both in Venezuela and beyond, that Maduro's victory was illegitimate. Since the election, Venezuela has been subject to a series of crackdowns by Maduro's forces, and now things are only getting worse. The candidate who ran against Maduro as the lead opposition choice fled the country in early September, arriving in Spain to seek asylum. And while the overall opposition leader, a woman named Maria Corina Machado, remains in Venezuela, she's had to stay mostly in hiding. Maduro's forces have engaged in broadening repressive acts, including arbitrary detentions en masse, harassment campaigns, and extrajudicial killings. More news, just hours old at the time of writing, has come out involving allegations by Maduro that the American CIA plotted to assassinate Venezuela's leader, with 3 Americans, 2 Spaniards, and a Czech national now apparently arrested in the country. The US has forcefully denied the claims. With Maduro closing the walls in, the hopes of Venezuela's political opposition are fading quickly, and in a nation where widespread and abject poverty and shortages of basic goods are already commonplace, it appears that things will only get worse in the months to come. And then there's the potential impact Venezuela's ongoing disintegration could have on its various neighbors. Already the nation is the site of one of the world's worst displacement crises. Some 8 million Venezuelans have fled the utter economic collapse overseen by Maduro, mostly to Colombia, but also to Brazil and the United States. Now there are fears that millions more could leave. Before the election, some 40% of Venezuelans said they would abandon the country if things didn't change. That's millions upon millions of people desperate to leave this dying nation. If they really do flee Maduro's latest wave of repression, the consequences could be felt in nations across the Americas. Mexico cartels. Northward from Venezuela, we've also got to touch on Mexico, particularly areas of the nation that are controlled by its various powerful drug cartels. There, it appears that a gang war is only just beginning, with cartel sicarios massing to fight not just government forces, but each other. The spark that lit the flame was the arrest of a prominent drug lord called El Mayo, arrested after an alleged betrayal by his longtime allies, the sons of the infamous imprisoned drug lord El Chapo. Although El Mayo was long regarded as either a number 2 or a hidden hand guiding El Chapo, the former kingpin's sons lured El Mayo into US custody back in July, and in the week since, a war between the Mayos, the supporters of El Mayo, and the Chapitos, the supporters of El Chapo's sons, has been brewing. As of now, that war appears to have begun after convoys of gunmen attacked all across the Sinaloa cartel-controlled Costa Rica, and that's a Mexican township of that name, not the country, and simultaneous firefights kicked off all across the city of Culiacan. The death toll in the following days is hard to pinpoint, largely because cartels will pick up the bodies of their own fallen before they can be counted, but the Sinaloa provincial leadership has been transparent about its inability to contain the violence, despite the presence of Mexican special forces on the street. How long the violence lasts and how far it goes will likely depend on the scale of each side's involvement. But with cartel matters kept secret for the cartels alone, we'll need to wait and see until explosions of violence reveal just what sort of hydra Mexico is now dealing with. Unfortunately, we could talk for quite a while longer about all the unrest and upheaval around the world and still not cover it all. In each of the conflicts that we've discussed, there are endless details that we've not been able to cover, but that we encourage you to search for if you'd like to learn more. There are crises ongoing in Libya, Afghanistan, South Sudan, northern Nigeria, southern Syria, Somalia, Ethiopia's Sahara region, the Balochistan region of Pakistan, and other corners of the world that are no less important to the people living there as any of these conflicts are to the people caught in the middle. For the next few months, as 2024 closes out, there will inevitably be surprises thrown at the world, perhaps including surprises from regions that we haven't covered today. Certainly the regions we have covered are going to surprise us in their own unique and sometimes horrific ways. For our part, here on The Situation Room, we'll be here to explain it as it happens. Stay tuned, spread the word, and get ready. We guarantee there's more on the way. And thank you for watching.